Welcome everyone. Hello, and welcome to our monthly online seminars of open science meeting. This is our sixth appointment this year, and we are hosting Dr. Rose Traps. Before introducing you, I have just a few things to say before we start. One is that these seminars are held in collaboration with IP, which is the Italian Association of Psychology, so we thank them for their support. And also, I wish to remind you that we do have a YouTube channel, itrn.org an itrn.org YouTube channel where all of our online seminars are hosted and uploaded after they're held. So you can access all of our past seminars, and these and all the future seminars will be uploaded as well. And we also it would be really helpful if you subscribe to the channel, because of course the more subscriptions we have, the more visibility our content has. And along the same lines, we also have an itrn.org website where you can find information on all of our activities, and you can become a part and a member of the ITRN community. You find all the relative links in the slides. Apart from this, back to our speaker. Rose Traps is a postdoctoral research fellow at Agenis, which is the Center for the Study of Life Sciences at the University of Exeter in the UK. She works in philosophy of science, studying concepts and practices in ecology and related fields, and she completed her PhD in 2021 at Bielefeld University in Germany, with a thesis on the concept of individuality in behavioral ecology. Rose's postdoc in Exeter is part of Sabina Leonelli's project, A Philosophy of Open Science for Diverse Research Environments, which investigates the consequences of open science practices for equity and diversity in science. So welcome, Rose. We're really glad that you're here. And I'll let you share your screen now.
Great, thank you so much.
One thing I'm rushing that I forgot was also, as you probably saw in the message in the chat, if you have questions, we will have a question and answer time right after Rose's presentation. You can raise your hand or indicate that you want to ask a question by simply writing the word question in between square brackets in the chat, and we will let you speak. Or if you rather not ask your question directly, you can just ask the question, write your question in the chat in English or in Italian, and we will read it out or translate it as needed. If you are a PhD student, please signal it, because this way we can give you precedence, since this is an initiative mainly directed at PhD and young researchers. Okay.
Cool. So I'll start screen sharing.
Mm-hmm.
Good. Okay. So you're seeing my slides okay?
Yep.
Great. So thank you so much for the invitation to be here and for the nice introduction. I'm looking forward to talking to you all today about the philosophy of open science. So I'll start off, I mean, I know we're in a seminar series on open science, but I'll start off by making sure we're all on the same page by briefly laying out what open science is and a little bit about what philosophers of science are interested in when looking at open science and what we think we can contribute. Then I will focus on the work that we're doing at Exeter University in this project that Federica mentioned on the philosophy of open science, headed by Sabina Leonelli. So I'll be talking about the broad thematic that we're focusing on in the project, the relationship between open science and epistemic diversity. And then I will focus in on some of the research that I'm doing in the project in relation to open science and its role in ecology. I'm aware that most of you aren't ecologists, but I'm hoping that some of the lessons that I draw out with respect to both open data and citizen science might be interesting and potentially also applicable to other fields. So to start off with, what is open science? as the figure on the left-hand side of the slide indicates, open science is many different things. Often when people first hear open science, they think open access, so the publication of scientific articles and books in a way that is free of charge to read for anybody. But as I'm sure most of you are aware, being in this seminar, open science is much more than just open access. It also includes things like open data and open source software, so publishing the data or the code that lies behind scientific publications, and a range of other practices, things like open lab notebooks and open hardware, open educational resources or open evaluation of researchers, as well as things like citizen science and crowdfunding research. So a range of practices. What brings them all together is the idea of opening up some aspect of the research process to some people other than those professional scientists who were initially involved in the research. So that could be opening up data to other researchers. It could be opening up participation in data collection to members of the public. It could be opening up textbooks to those who can't afford to pay for kind of those really expensive textbooks that we're all familiar with. So all sorts of things, but this shared goal of opening up science. So many researchers encounter open science first and foremost as a policy that either their university or their funding bodies are putting onto them as something that they ought to do. Often this is justified with the idea that it's enhancing the transparency of research, it's providing benefit back to the people that fund research, for instance, when it's taxpayer-funded research. And generally, the idea is that these policies are put in place in order to improve the quality of research happening at public institutions like most universities. In addition to being a policy, though, open science is also a movement. There's many really passionate researchers from across many different disciplines, often junior researchers like yourselves, who are really keen on this idea of opening up science as a way to reform science. The idea here is that something's not going quite right with the way that scientific research is currently being practiced. And in order to improve that we've got to engage in some sort of open science practices. And often this revolves around issues to do with questionable research practices or research misconduct. And I'm sure many of you will have heard of these sorts of situations where data has been manipulated or fabricated, or even where there's potentially less serious, but there's been cases of, or many cases of things like p-hacking and harking. And in response to these sorts of questionable practices and misconduct, many people have called for greater transparency as a way to enable other researchers to check what's going on and to identify mistakes or malpractice in order to improve the quality of science. And finally, in relation to being a policy and a movement, open science is a norm for science. The idea behind both policy and movement modes of open science is that open science is good science. So that's the normative aspect. And it's the idea is often that it's good in a number of different ways. Epistemologically, so in relation to the quality or the reliability of the knowledge that's being produced, but also ethically and politically. Often open science is justified because it redistributes benefits, it improves diversity in science, it increases equality amongst scientific researchers, it ensures that appropriate credit is being given where it's due for participants in research. So all these sorts of ethical and political aspects to open science are also part of the normative ideal of open science. And this is where many philosophers can start to think about contributing to thinking about open science, when we can ask, how is it that open science is changing science? And is it really good science in the way that it's currently being practiced? So that's exactly what we're asking in the project, A Philosophy of Open Science for Diverse Research Environments, which is currently based at the University of Exeter, but will soon be moving primarily to the Technical University of Munich, where Sabina Leonelli, the PI of the project, is taking up a professorship. So we're asking about how open science is changing science and whether it really is changing it for the better. And we're also considering how open science might be itself reformed in order to foster research practice that actively supports diversity. And you can see more information about the project on the website if you're interested. So this focus on diversity comes from some work that Sabina has been doing over the past few years, looking at how open science policies and open science practices are currently being implemented in the sciences. And she makes a number of points in this research. First off, many open science policies are implemented or understood in a one-size-fits-all approach. So the idea is that all researchers, no matter what sort of research they're doing, where they're doing research, should adopt the same sorts of practices. And Sabina has argued that these policies tend to privilege some forms of inquiry over others. So if you think here about things like pre-registration, which is an open science practice that is somewhat newer than some of the other practices, I'm sure many of you are familiar with it, but the basic idea is that researchers put out or create a very, very detailed plan for their research that they're going to conduct, with very explicit characterization of the hypotheses that they're planning on testing, or of the data that they're going to collect, or the experiments that they're going to perform. And then this pre-registration, this detailed plan, is used to check when they're publishing their research whether they've followed the plan, whether they've to ensure that they haven't engaged in these sorts of questionable research practices like p-hacking or like cherry picking their data and so on. So pre-registration, it's an important open science practice that's celebrated and that's being adopted by many different researchers in many different disciplines, because it helps to improve transparency, and it increases these or it addresses some of these issues with questionable research practices. But it also is much easier to do if you're doing those sorts of experimental, highly controlled, highly planned studies. And in contrast, if you're doing a study that's maybe more exploratory or more qualitative, it's typically quite difficult to give detailed plans in advance about the hypotheses that you might be testing. Maybe you aren't starting with hypotheses. What then do you put in your pre-registration form? Maybe you're doing snowball sampling, and so you don't have a predetermined sample size. What do you put then in your pre-registration form? So for researchers conducting these more exploratory or qualitative studies, it tends to be much more difficult to perform a pre-registration or to satisfy the requirements of a pre-registration. Obviously, there are people out there who are developing pre-registration protocols for these other forms of research, but as it stands, a one-size-fits-all approach to pre-registration just it makes it much easier for those experimental and kind of very controlled sorts of studies, and much more difficult for others, which then, as a consequence, privileges those experimental studies over others. It's just easier to fulfill open science requirements when you're doing these experimental studies. Similarly, there's typically little recognition in the open science movement or in open science policies of how goals and practices are adapted to suit local contexts. And an example here comes from research that Sabina has done with some of her colleagues, looking at open science practices amongst researchers in Africa. And quite surprisingly, they found that these researchers were choosing to purchase at great expense proprietary software rather than using open source alternatives that were available. And it turns out that although there were these open source alternatives, researchers in Africa were hesitant to use them because when they purchased software, that was seen as a mark of good quality research by journals and editors at journals and reviewers and so on. So it made it easier for them to publish in good quality journals. This kind of seems a bit counterintuitive, but it makes sense when you think about the idea that these costly research resources are a way, in a sense, of buying credit, improving your trustworthiness for outsiders. So as a consequence, then, even though there might be these open source alternatives out there, they're not going to be equally accessible and usable by people in different contexts, due not only to the availability of resources that they have, but also due to things like biases and self-understandings about what counts as good quality research and how to get research out there, how best to get research out there. So finally, partly as a consequence or a sort of vicious cycle, as a result of these biases in the way open science affects different researchers in doing different sorts of research or working in different contexts, there's a risk that open science can concentrate research even to a greater extent in more privileged institutions. Again, this might seem counterintuitive, but it makes sense if you think about things like open data. So one of the justifications for publishing more open data is that it means that people who are working in less well-resourced institutions can make use of that data without having to conduct their own experiments. So it's supposed to improve access, for instance, to these great experimental results that are being conducted at important research labs so that others can make use of them and generate high quality research outputs. The problem is most of the people that can make use of open data are actually those who are already working at privileged institutions. They're people who have the computing power, the bandwidth, the junior researchers out there with the time and the expertise to be able to engage in these large-scale data analyses. So open data actually risks concentrating then the use of high-quality data further within these institutions that have that capacity to make use of data. So you get a situation where people are producing data all around the world, but it's only getting turned into high quality research outputs in these privileged institutions. So that maybe gives you a sense for some of the concerns that we might be having about open science in relation to its consequences for diversity in science in terms of both the different approaches that researchers might be taking, as well as the different contexts that they're working in. And it's here where the project is intervening. We are a group of PhD students, postdocs, and more advanced researchers. And we're taking a kind of an interdisciplinary philosophy and social science approach to thinking about open science. So there's a number of different researchers on the project who are looking at open science practices and how they're carried out in low-resourced research environments. And as you can see from that pie chart, which is kind of an overview of the different sub-projects or strands in the project, you can see that there's a wide variety of different case studies that we're looking at there, many of which are focused on agriculture, but there's also some in relation to health data and other life sciences. So we're looking at what consequences open science has for epistemic diversity and epistemic justice. And moving forward in the project, the goal is to use those insights in order to develop more equitable and effective open science policies. And there'll be a postdoc coming onto the project, hopefully over the next few years, who will specifically be engaging with Sabina on these more practical policy sort of questions. So that's the project in a nutshell. It's a bit of a quick overview. So if you have any questions in the Q&A, I'm happy to answer them. But I thought I would take the rest of this time that I have today to flesh out in a bit more detail what I've been doing on the project. And like I said, it's in relation to ecology, but hopefully you can find out something interesting, and maybe there's similarities that you notice in your own fields. So I'll start by talking about data synthesis studies and what they can tell us about how open data is playing out in ecology. And then I will talk briefly about citizen science and its consequences for epistemic diversity. So as some of you might be aware, there's various different, and as I sort of already mentioned to a certain extent, there's various different reasons behind opening up data. Partly it's to do with greater transparency and accountability. Think those questionable research practices or research misconduct cases. We want greater access to data so that we can check that it exists and that it doesn't have too many mistakes in it and that it really does support the findings. There's also additional reasonings behind opening up data. These include greater efficiency and effectiveness. And these are these ideas around enabling reuse of data or interoperability of data, ensuring that people can don't have to waste resources performing more and more experiments, that instead that they can make use of the valuable data that's already been created by other scientists. And there's a lot of discussion in the open data sphere around ensuring that data is made open in a way that's ethical and just, so that it enables, for instance, Indigenous communities to both make greater use of data that's being generated in the context of their communities, but also to ensure that that data is being governed in a way that's appropriate to the norms and practices that they engage in. So in the context of the talk today, I'll focus here on this argument for greater efficiency and effectiveness, and thinking there about how open data, whether open data can enhance the efficiency and effectiveness of research, and in what ways, and at what cost. So bear that in mind, because I'll come back to it after I've talked about synthesis studies. So synthesis studies is a term that's used in ecological research to describe the sorts of studies that take data from many heterogeneous sources. So often that involves kind of scraping a lot of data from different databases on the internet, but it can also involve contacting data providers to get their data sets, and combining this heterogeneous data into a synthetic data set, and then using that data set to create a model. And the interesting thing about synthesis studies is that they have this dual output. They create a model, but they also publish the data set as a new resource for ecologists. The idea here is we've put a lot of work into this synthetic data set. Here, now you can have it and use it to answer your questions, as well as obviously looking at our model and finding out about the specific findings, the specific use we've made of that data set. So in that sense, synthesis studies, although they're very similar to and closely related to meta-analyses and things like that, they're distinctive in this dual output aspect. So I was interested in how synthesis studies work and what they can teach us about open data more generally. And there's a paper that is coming out soon, hopefully, in the journal PTP Bio. There's a preprint online if you're interested in finding out more about this work. So I'll try not to go into too many details, but I chose a specific case study to work with to think about how these synthesis studies work. The case study was from the field of movement ecology, which is the study of animal movement, often involving putting GPS tags or radio tags onto animals to be able to track where they're going in the environment. And a few years ago, there was a big synthesis study that was conducted, which gathered data, animal tracking data of marine predators. So predators, things like seals and whales and birds that operate in the sea, that forage and hunt in the sea, and in particular in relation to Antarctica and the Southern Ocean ecosystems. So these researchers were interested in identifying areas in the Southern Ocean that were requiring greater protection, which meant that they gathered data from over 20 years, I think it was over 2 decades of studies on these different species. These studies involved many different sorts of technologies, many species, a great time span, obviously, and they were all conducted for their own specific purposes. And what these researchers did is gather that data all together and used it to create a model to identify these areas, what they called areas of ecological significance, these areas needing protection in the Southern Ocean. The basic idea was that we can look where these animals tend to be going in the ocean, and those are the areas that have a higher biodiversity because there's lots of fish there that they're eating, fish and also plankton and krill and things like that. So they analyzed all of this data to identify then areas that seem to be particularly important as foraging areas for these species. And these then they could compare to, say, fisheries data to find out where which areas are under particular threat from fishing or from other sorts of shipping activities. So that was the modeling side of what they were doing. At the same time, they published a data paper which described in much greater detail how they generated the synthetic data set and some potential uses that other people could make of this data set. And that's that on the left-hand, the right-hand side of that slide. You can see the citation there. What's interesting then, looking at that data paper in particular, and its very detailed descriptions of how they generated the synthetic data set, is that researchers typically face a dilemma when they're doing this sort of synthesis study. So on the one hand, you want to make a data set like this easy to use. So for instance, the researchers in this case, when they pulled all of their data together, they did things like removing data that had to do with movement on land because they were interested in movement at sea. And including movement on land just made things far too messy. Not all of those species actually move on land. Seals do, birds do to a certain extent, but whales don't. And so it increased the noise in the data set and wasn't necessary for the sorts of questions they were interested in. So there were many similar choices that they made throughout the creation of this synthetic data set that made it easier to use for particular purposes. At the same time, though, that just as a matter of fact, decreases the diversity of purposes for which that synthetic data set can be used. So you remove the on-land data, it means you can only use that data set to study at sea data, even though originally there would have been some information you could have used to answer questions about on-land movement of animals. And there are some valid questions that people might have to do with, for instance, social interactions or parent-child, parent-offspring interactions, which tend to happen on land rather than at sea. And these questions then just can't be answered with this sort of a data set. And that's all kind of well and good. Yes, we make choices when we're creating data sets, and they have to do with making sure that we can use the data for the purposes that we have. The issue it becomes more interesting when we start to think that this synthetic data set is being put out there as a resource for ecologists to use. So they're going to come to this data set about animal tracking data set, and they're going to say, oh, so what can I do with this data set? Oh, well, it's about marine, like movement at sea. Okay, so I'll ask some questions about movement at sea. And any questions about on-land movement will kind of fall to the wayside as things that aren't going to be investigated going forward with this as a resource. So what does this mean then for thinking about open data? We need to start thinking, I think, about how these synthesis studies, they use and create new open data resources, and that the efficiency of these resources, the extent to which we can easily use them for certain purposes, might come at the expense of the diversity of research directions that they allow for. And this is something that I think all researchers, in fact, in all disciplines, need to start thinking about when they're looking at the open data resources. Lots of people are concerned that these resources aren't being used to the extent that they ideally should be. And so they're calling for greater standardization of data or greater synthetic data, greater synthesis efforts with respect to open data. But they need to recognize that this sort of standardization and synthesis work might then restrict the sorts of uses to which that data could be put. And this is a trade-off that I think that there will be a decision or some decisions that will need to be made, but I think we should be aware of what the consequences of those are. Okay, so shifting gears a little bit in the last section of this talk, I want to briefly introduce some work that I've been doing on citizen science. This work is far less advanced. It's more at the beginning, but I hope at least I can give you a sense for where I'm going with this research. So citizen science is a form of public participation in scientific research, or PPSR. It's a kind of a wordy way of saying involving members of the public in research. And PPSR includes a wide variety of different ways in which you can involve members of the public in research. So it includes things like community science and participatory action research, both of which tend to involve very close collaborations between members of local communities facing particular problems and researchers in academic institutions, often research targeted at solving or addressing the particular problems that these communities are facing. Often then these are things like pollution or particular health conditions or diseases that then researchers try to help communities with by involving them in conducting research on these particular problems and solutions to those problems. So that's one mode of involving the public in scientific research. There's also things like DIY science, which is when members of the public almost completely independently of professional scientists conduct their own research, often very technologically driven, where they do things like make their own, well, there's a lot of 3D printing and creating their own kits and things like that. And then on the other side of the spectrum is citizen science, which, if you haven't heard of it, it tends to involve kind of getting huge numbers of people out there, just ordinary folk, to collect data for professional scientists. Often this is data about the natural environment, so things like looking at plants or animals out there in the world and reporting your observations. It can also include things like collecting water samples or air samples to provide to scientists to analyze, or even things like going on the net and looking at pictures of galaxies and analyzing those pictures. So there's a wide range of things that citizen scientists are doing, but the general thing is that they're helping scientists to conduct, helping professional scientists to conduct research. And I should mention citizen science. So all of these are ways of opening up participation in scientific research. Citizen science in particular tends to be considered part of the open science movement, but the others to a lesser extent, but I would say that they would also count towards open science. So a number of philosophers and social scientists have started thinking about public participation in scientific research and its relationship to epistemic diversity. In particular, they've argued that these more collaborative and co-created sorts of projects, the community science and participatory action research and things like this, that these sorts of projects can enhance epistemic diversity. And that's because they involve recognizing and mobilizing expertise of people in these local communities affected by these problems. They typically also allow for the generation of new knowledge and knowledge-making practices that are created through this collaboration between members of communities and professional scientists. So the practices differ from what a professional scientist might have done, as well as from what a member of the community might have done without a professional scientist's help. And finally, many of these projects allow for members of the public to engage in a sort of critical evaluation of the professional scientists' norms and assumptions. In particular, the new perspectives that they bring into science can help to identify norms and assumptions, so background ideas about how the world works or how knowledge should be created. They can identify when these might be actually biasing the science that's getting done, and then help to correct those biases. And there's some citations at the bottom of the slide there if you're interested in these sorts of ideas. The question is, what about citizen science? So unlike these very collaborative and co-created modes of involving the public, in citizen science, participants' primary role is really limited to data collection rather than creating methods or contributing to the sorts of questions that are being asked and these sorts of things. In addition, some empirical work has shown that participants in citizen science tend not to be very diverse. They tend to be middle-aged, well-educated. In countries like the US or in places like Europe, they tend to be white. And so there's a real question there about whether citizen science can be expected to enhance epistemic diversity. And many people have kind of implicitly assumed that it can't. So to answer this sort of a question, I've been doing a case study looking at eBird India. eBird is a birdwatching data platform where birdwatchers can upload the observations that they're making of individuals and species. And it was originally developed in the US by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, but it's since spread worldwide. And it's been particularly successful in India. So eBird is the biggest source of biodiversity data on the globe, which is pretty crazy. These are just ordinary people contributing data. And of all of that eBird data, eBird India is the third largest contributor, so just behind the US and Canada. So I've been looking at how eBird India is used, what sort of practices are involved in getting bird watchers to make use of this global platform in local contexts, and what sort of consequences it might have for diversity. And I've been noticing some interesting things. So there is a tendency for these sorts of global platforms to kind of close down diversity to a certain extent, or to homogenize and standardize practices. And this is just in the nature of creating a big data set. You've got to get people to enter data in certain ways that can talk to each other, that can be combined in one data set. And so there's things like standardizing the taxonomies and data collection protocols that birdwatchers are using the same names for species or intertranslatable species, making sure that the distinctions between species are the same, making sure that people are entering in their data in the correct way without, and often using short periods of time, so short checklists. But at the same time that there's this kind of standardizing and homogenizing side of using eBird, there's also a lot of practices that seem to have a more complicated relationship to diversity. So there's a strong element of building biodiversity data knowledge and skills in the public, and in particular spreading skills and knowledge to more marginalized communities. There's also often a recognition of local expertise and evidential practices. In particular, there's a national system, and most countries have this by now, of eBird reviewers. And these will be people who are recognized as experts in bird watching and in the local bird diversity. And they help to ensure that data is of the best quality. And finally, I've heard a number of reports of people making use of eBird, this platform, in order to conduct their own local studies, often for specific conservation purposes. So going out to a specific wetland and doing a more systematic survey using eBird for to collect your data, in order to, say, make a claim that that's an important wetland that requires conservation. So what this leads me to think at the moment, as I mentioned, this is still ongoing, but it seems pretty clear that these sorts of citizen science projects have an ambivalent effect on epistemic diversity. So they include recognizing, cultivating, and enabling, but also marginalizing and excluding diverse forms of biodiversity knowledge and knowledge-making practices. So it's really ambivalent. It pulls in both directions. So over the next few years, I'll be looking into these questions in relation to citizen science and epistemic diversity, and also thinking more about things like how to evaluate citizen science data, and how citizen science data and its dominance in kind of amongst biodiversity data, how that might be directing research along similar lines to the work that I did with respect to the synthesis studies. So that is kind of a very quick run through what we're looking at in this Philosophy of Open Science project. We are, to remind you, exploring the complexities and consequences of open science for science and society. And I gave you two examples: the tension between efficiency and diversity in synthesis studies on the one hand, and the dynamics of epistemic diversity in citizen science on the other. And looking forward, we'll be aiming to develop and potentially even implement some suggestions for improving open science to support diversity, building on the lessons that we've learned from the research that we've been conducting in the project. And with that, I would like to say thank you very much for your attention. Thank you, of course, to the other members of the project who are listed on the slide there, and to the people that I've been speaking to in relation to eBird India for their time and for sharing their views. And I look forward to your questions.
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Rose. It was really an interesting presentation, also for the slightly different point of view compared to what we've had before. I'm gonna post again the instructions for our question and answers phase. But just in brief, if you want to ask a question, just raise your hand or write that you have a question, or write your question in the chat. I think Vittorio will moderate it, the next section.
Yeah. So in the meantime, I would start with a question related to the role of widespread initiatives, like, for example, Italian Reproducibility Network, or, for example, within institution initiatives, but that spread all over the single institution, for example, open science initiative of one specific university and so on. So such initiatives, they start in order to disseminate open science concepts, especially in those places where, for example, to date, they are not aware of open science practices and so on and so forth. And standardization, I think it's one of the key topics to disseminate practices and so on. But as far as I understood, it's also a source of tension, because it can just cut out all the diversity and complexity of maybe smaller and local initiatives that in some sense they should be preserved and listened to, and in any case encouraged to keep their diversity or complexity all over further initiatives or widespread initiatives. So my point is whether the role of these widespread initiatives, like reproducibility networks, still nowadays a thing. It's still worth for people like us to commit to widespread initiatives, or we should start, for example, bottom up and going place by place and say, okay, let's start from here and then try to construct something starting from the bottom. And just point, special case ITRN, it actually started from the bottom. It's not like an initiative financed by the government or whatever. We were just a bunch of people talking to each other and try to build something. But still, I think that right now that we are, let's say, in a freshly developed phase where we want to build something which is more widespread, I think we are falling into this tension. So
yeah, thank you for the question. And I think it points to a really important tension that obviously you yourself are experiencing in your group, but that is experienced around like in all areas of science, this kind of how do you, because there obviously are commonalities that you will be building on, that you will identify. You're all working in a similar kind of context in the sense that you're all engaged in research in Italy, and there's very specific situations that you're facing there with respect to funding and the university structure and how you can like secure further employment and how researchers are evaluated, all of these things which you would identify as commonalities despite some kind of differences amongst yourselves. At the same time, you're kind of you will be kind of just by the nature of the sort of network that you're building, unable to address the very specific issues that people might be facing in their own home disciplines or home universities or wherever it is. And yeah, it's a tension. I see it in the case of eBird as well, where you've got this, I mean, there's great advantages to having a global platform, but it loses out on some of the kinds of more local aspects of how bird watching might be conducted, or what sorts of needs people might have with respect to their data in particular contexts. And it's, I guess the major thing to say would be that it's probably better to try and have both. You know, to have broad scale networks that focus on commonalities that can then serve as voices for their communities, but to also allow for smaller kind of, not networks per se, but smaller consciousness raising groups with respect to the sorts of challenges people are facing, these sorts of things. And maybe then the challenge is to develop some sort of interface between those. So to stay in contact with people that are still on the ground doing their small scale things. So yeah, it's a challenge.
Maybe I would have another comment. So do you think that because this is something maybe someone in the audience could also, let's say, something more, because I'm not an expert, but I think multi-center studies, especially many people in this audience would have a background in psychology or cognitive science. That would be my guess, but still, multi-center studies are nowadays something big. I would say that they are like the thing right now in psychology or cognitive science. My point is that so would you see an opportunity to, for example, communicate to, for example, countries or people coming from a researching institution very far from our everyday experience? Would you see an opportunity to spread approaches, practices, and way of working to these institutions, and somehow let's say, make research practices more homogeneous throughout other countries? Or the actual point would be, for example, just to include different research practices within the multi-center studies, and then losing, I would say, for example, sample size and an opportunity to have just tons and tons of participants spread throughout the world. So what would be a way to formulate a correct scientific question in such a setting?
Yeah, I mean, I won't be able to give you an answer that's completely satisfactory, obviously, but it does touch on, I think, one of the major issues that scientists are facing across the board at the moment, which is how to deal with this, or how to balance getting some sort of like the demands of reproducibility, getting some sort of an answer to a scientific question that's going to be generalizable, that's going to apply to many different cases, that has sufficient statistical power, these sorts of things, while at the same time so just doing that, so having enough statistical power while also having something that's going to be generalizable, and they don't necessarily always go together. So there's been I'm less familiar with, I'm somewhat familiar with psychology, but more familiar with behavioral studies in non-human animals. And there you see a lot of discussions of these multi-institution studies where they're trying to get systematic variation of environmental variables. to make sure that the sorts of findings that they're generating are not just specific to certain laboratory environments. And they have some really great things where they find that, like, oh, suddenly if you start, if you do this at multiple different institutions, you notice that things like the times of day that they're being fed, or like the sorts of bacteria that there are hanging around in the cages, that these make a difference to the research outputs that you're having. And the standard response was, the traditional response was to then reduce the heterogeneity to get a much more controlled laboratory environment. And these days they're going in the opposite direction of saying, okay, we want to have much more variation so that we can ensure that the findings that we're generating aren't just specific to these certain sorts of conditions, these heavily controlled conditions. But obviously that means you need way more animals because you've just got to have more animals under different sorts of conditions, which is then more expensive and takes more time and all these sorts of things. So you see a pattern there where people are having to deal with or figure out how to respond to differences, heterogeneity, dependencies, in a way that is possible, given the sorts of resources that they have available, and that will also then deliver the sorts of results that are meaningful in some way. I should also say, you mentioned something interesting in your question, which is this idea that do these like multi-institution studies lead to a kind of spreading of certain sorts of practices to different institutions? And I think that's an interesting point, that they may have a tendency to encourage then certain sorts of practices as best practice. And you see this not just with respect to experiments, but also for there's been these like multi-analyst studies. I know of a case in ecology where they did a big multi-analyst study where they had one data set, they gave it to a bunch of different people to analyze. And an outcome of that is that people make lots of different decisions in how they're analyzing the data. But another outcome is that there's then an implicit idea about what are the best decisions, or the most common or most appropriate sorts of decisions to make with respect to analyzing your data, and what is potentially more questionable. And although this can be good because there are a lot of people that may have kind of not particularly ideal approaches to data analysis or experimental design, it also does risk kind of quashing the sorts of diversity that might be actually profitable or kind of valuable in a scientific community, in terms of what methodological approaches are being adopted, what sorts of choices are being made with respect to the sorts of assumptions you might make in data analysis, these sorts of things. So it's a risk that we should probably be bearing in mind with these multi-analyst studies, yeah.
Thanks.
I don't see any other booked questions now, but something you just said in answering Victoria's last question just made me think of another one, in that it sounds like one really helpful thing that probably we don't do very often is trying to make more explicit exactly what our goals are with one type of practice or another. So, for example, distinguishing between things we do to kind of reach an agreement on what some standard practices would be, and then some other things that we could do to, I don't know, increase diversity, or simply exploring things that go beyond whatever standard we agreed on to see if they might actually improve our standards or not. So I guess my question, okay, it's more of a comment than a question. It's just something that came into my mind, so I'm thinking about it as I speak. But I realized that actually it's something I've never given that much thought to until now. So I guess probably it's something that it would be helpful to introduce in common discourse every time we speak about open science. So leave more space to clarify what our goals should be with one project or another. Also, going back to the example of multi-lob studies, and so, you know, we probably can have both kinds of things. So some work dedicated, or some kind of studies very controlled, that look at figuring out exactly what is the effect under some specific conditions, and then some others less controlled that maybe will bring up a number of additional factors that affect the effects.
Yeah, totally. And a nice example of that as well that's slightly different is in this context of the synthesis studies that I was talking about. One thing that I found is that there's this compromise that the researchers strike when they're creating these synthetic data sets, because they're aware of the challenge that, like, the more you standardize a data set, the less it can be used for more diverse purposes. And so what they did is they published it alongside some code that you could use to tweak the data set in some ways.
Okay. So make it less, like, keep some of the diversity in it.
Exactly. Yeah. So there was like this like ready to go data set that you could just pump into your into your own models, or you could have like you could get the slightly like
rawer version.
Yeah, slightly raw. The data set, like a few analytical steps beforehand with the code, and then you can tweak some of the, like, twiddle some of the levers so that you can get a slightly different data set based on, there were things like they had steps to do with how they were dealing with gaps in the data, or time steps and things like this. So that's like this flexibility sort of compromise. I think that's what I called it in the paper. That's something that I think you're going to see more as people are becoming aware of these issues, that you want to have, like, resources out there or studies being done that are kind of transplantable, that you can just plug and play, but you're also going to want to give people some options to twiddle around with there so that they can fit it to their own purposes or their own goals. Yeah.
Cool. If we don't have any more questions, I think we've reached our time.
Shall I go with the last slide?
Yep, I can share it if you want.
Okay, thanks.
Before you do, I just want to say thank you for the questions, but also if anybody has any questions that they had that they just didn't quite get in there, feel free to write an email to me or to Sabina, and we'd both be happy to answer any of your questions.
Thank you very much. Rose, and I think also Sabina's email, well, Rose for sure is in the slides you presented, so they will be available on the YouTube with a video, and then of course you can find them. Sorry, share screen.
Yeah, so thanks again, Rose, and thanks to all the people that attended the meeting. If you request a certificate of attendance, you will receive it within the next 7 days, as well as if you request the certificate, you will also receive the link to the YouTube video, because that's when it's going to appear. We'll wait for you to book another place in the virtual room for the next seminar, May 8th, 2024, 10 a.m. Central Europe Summer Time. So in the morning with Dr. Wolf van Pijmel. And the topic will be increasing transparency through a multiverse analysis. So for now, thanks for attending. Thanks again to the speaker, and we'll see you next time.